Ira, wonderful to again be on stage with you, not just in the same day, but we've done this in Bangalore. We've been together. You've moderated me for some of my book discussions. It's wonderful to now do this for you. Let's begin. Before we go into the book, there's something in our earlier discussion that we briefly touched on, which is, and something that you have been very active in, which is not just the idea of women stories in history in your earlier works like Daughters of the Sun, but also the concept of women writing history. I want you to just tell us this whole, how the process has been for you as a woman writing history and as somebody uncovering the stories of powerful, interesting women in Indian history.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I know you are very in demand to be moderator and to speak about your own books. Through a very happy coincidence, Manu and I happen to bring out books at similar times, every few years. So it's wonderful to be in conversation with him and to be with all of you here. So Manu really understands my work for the past few years, what I've been trying to do. And it's very true that a lot of our histories, most of it really, I think there's a figure which is something like 95% of recorded history deals with the works and achievements of men, and often, of course, written by men. Most of the historians have been men. The sponsors have been men. So we get history written through a certain lens, talking about certain things, whether it's battles or conquests or various, points of view which tend to be much more favorable to the men, so that the women get whitewashed out of history. And I think we are now seeing a lot of revision about that. A lot of women writers, women historians are taking to the field. And what I think that changes is that as a woman, you have a gaze on the same materials. So oftentimes I am looking at the same materials that have been present there for men historians and men writers, men scholars. But perhaps I pick up on certain things because I am a woman, because I am aware of the fact that certain things will get written out. So, Manu, you are very aware of the fact of Gulbadan Begum's biography, for example. So, the daughter of Babur had written a wonderful biography in her time. In the 16th century, which was a very unique document for that time for a Muslim woman writing from within the parda. But despite the fact that she was Akbar's aunt, when the official biographies came out, there was no reference of this biography, of Begum's biography. And in subsequent years, all the great Mughal historians never referred to her at all. And in fact, even in the 20th century, all our academics and historians here in India had completely forgotten and wouldn't refer to her. It took the work of a feminist historian, Ruby Lal, to rediscover this work and bring it out into public consciousness. So this is something that happens, I think, story after story. When I look at things, I think I am primed as a woman to look at the little details. So sometimes I might ignore the big wars, and the big conquests, because the women's stories are often in the details and they fall between the cracks. So, for example, in my latest book, The Begums, or the Lion and the Lily, the Begums of Awadh, I found, were equally important to the history of that region in the 18th century. Equally, if not more, important, because they stood up to the British incursion at that time with far more determination than Asaf-ud-Daula and Shuja-ud-Daula, the great Nawabs of that time, did. And this was something that intrigued me. So I immediately picked up on that. There is only one source, again, that deals with this story, that deals with the lives of the Begum. So it's not true that there is no primary material. There is actually a source by an insider, by somebody who was the right-hand man of a Khwaja Sara, a eunuch. And he wrote detailed stories about the Begums, about the Khwaja Saras, how they lived their lives, how they stood up to Hastings, and the price they paid in consequence of that. But that has been completely forgotten. Even Lucknowis today will tell me, yes, we know that Bahu Begum was important, but we knew nothing of these details. So I suppose as it's very important not just to be talking about women in history, but as you said, to have women writing history, and to have women, of course, in every other field as well, because we are looking out for certain signals, certain achievements, which may fall by the wayside if it is a male historian who is trained in a certain way of thinking and who will not necessarily pick up on those details.
It's funny, I was thinking as you were speaking of this Begum in the Deccan, in the Nizam Shahi Sultanate, there were these miniature paintings of her, and she was a very powerful woman. She actually ruled for 6 years. Kunza Humayun. And then later, when her son came to power, they actually scratched out some of these paintings and reduced Kunza Humayun to this giant blob as opposed to an actual person in the paintings. But before I come to The Lion and the Lily, although you've written about women, you are a woman writing about history, it's also not possible to box you into that cliche thing that, oh, she's a woman, therefore she's writing about other women. Because now you've done the book on Akbar, which is about a man, his world. It's about empire building. It's a biography of this very important male figure. And even in The Lion and the Lily, although the Begums are an important presence, and you do point to the sexual politics that was involved, their agency as historical and political figures. At the same time, it's also a broader canvas. So on that note, firstly, tell us about the title. What does the lion and the lily really represent in the title?
So the title, as you will know, Manu, as a writer, I think the titles are what we have the most bitter fights with our publishers and editors about, right? Everything else, somehow we come to an understanding, but they have very strong points of view on the titles, and so do we, because we live with our books for so long. So I wanted a title that was at the same time poetic, enigmatic, that would catch the attention, but also had clues in it about what I was talking about. And I'm talking about a very complicated period of history. So I wanted to highlight two aspects to my book. And so the lion stands for the Nawabs of Awadh because the Nawabs of Awadh were Shias, and they used a Shia renaissance at the time in the late 18th century to create a very unique identity for themselves as opposed to the Mughal emperor who was a Sunni and who they were opposing by creating this enormous court in Awadh. At the same time, they are also opposing the Europeans.
One question, Ira.
Yeah.
For the Kerala audience, when you say Awadh, exactly what geography are we speaking?
Oh dear, a humbling moment. So Awadh, after Bengal and Bihar was taken over after the Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar by the British, Awadh was the next most important territory or suba or district, and it stretched right through the northern part of the country, almost from Delhi. From Delhi up to the border of Bengal and Bihar till the lower Himalayas. So it was a huge swathe of territory, the rich Indo-Gangetic plains, all of that was Awadh. So in a very important so-called buffer territory, the British called it a buffer territory between themselves and the Mughals at Delhi. So the lion is very important to the Shias because Imam Ali was called the Lion of God by Prophet Muhammad because he fought so bravely alongside Prophet Muhammad. So I wanted the lion as a symbol of the Indian powers. It also stands for Tipu Sultan, who has a walk-on role in my book because there is a connection there with the French. Tipu Sultan used the tiger, and in India, sher can mean lion or tiger. So the lion I felt was very appropriate for the Indian powers, and they were standing up to the lily. And the lily in this case is the French fleur de lis, because before the French, the Revolution, 1789, and the Republican Rosette, before then, the symbol of the French kings was the lily flower. So the lily in this case is the French lily, and the lion is the Indian lion.
Tell us what is happening in 18th century India, because your story is primarily set in the 18th century. It primarily revolves around two sultans, a couple of begums. So it's interesting, it's got these compelling figures. But the broader political landscape in the 18th century is also fascinating. You have the death of Aurangzeb, which is in many ways the start point of the book. And then the sands of politics in northern India are shifting. Just paint that picture for us as to what is happening.
Yeah, very true, Manu. It was an incredibly interesting, volatile, fractious, but also creative and very interesting time because, as Manu said, Aurangzeb dies in 1707, the Mughals having reigned for more than 200 years and more or less held the country together. And then all sorts of, infrastructural problems creep in, and the empire starts to crumble in the sense that there are increasing invasions as well because there's no longer this central authority at Delhi. So you will all be familiar with 1739 Nadir Shah's invasion of Delhi. And that was a very crucial time because that one battle, that one sort of violence against the Mughal emperor and against his great capital city of Delhi showed him to be this sort of paper emperor. This really showed to everybody that the emperor has very little power and very little resources to defend the country. So from that time onwards, what we see is that the governors in the various districts or subas, 22 odd subas in India, so these governors were meant to be transferred every 3 or 4 years, govern their regions, and send money back to the center. From 1739 onwards, they stopped doing that. So they start keeping the money instead of sending it back to the center, using it to develop their own ties, their own political networks, to develop the regions that they were assigned to, and they stopped allowing themselves to be transferred. So we start seeing the rise of very powerful governorships in various parts of India, whether Hyderabad, Mysore, some of the Rajput states, and of course, Awadh. So this was something very interesting that was happening because the Mughal emperor, even though by now he had very little actual physical military power and very few resources, he still stood for something that unified all of the country. This is something that we would see in 1857, how people came around and rallied around his cause. So a lot of these governors usurped some of these signals. So we see the transfer of certain cultural idioms, like in architecture. So we see how certain things like huge tombs, mausoleums, arches, decorations, these are all taken from the Mughals. But when they come to the Subas, as in Awadh, they are changed in a certain way. They are altered to create a new identity. So this is what the Nawabs of Awadh were able to do, with so much finesse and imagination. And it was happening a little bit everywhere. So all of the talent from Delhi, when they saw that the money had now gone to these governorships, had gone to these districts, all the talent from Delhi, the dancers, the musicians, the artists, the architects, they all sort of flooded to these so-called sub-imperial centers. And therefore, you see the rise of some very, very interesting music, art, and culture, which is patronized all over India in these various subas, and especially in Awadh. At the same time, it is the century of the European invasions, really. The Europeans really start entering in huge numbers. And an important thread that I try to bring in the story is the great Franco-English wars, global wars, which affect events on the ground in India.
So it's a time of political fragmentation, and that's leading to all these local governorships. But it's also leading these governors to start founding dynasties, hereditary dynasties. And in your book, we begin with a Nawab who's essentially from an immigrant family, from an immigrant Persian background, but he spawns this line of Nawabs that continues into the 19th century. Tell us about this very arresting figure, Shuja-ud-Dawla, and how he ends up founding what we would call the House of Awadh.
Yeah. So, this was a time in India, the 18th century. It was a very cosmopolitan place. You had immigrants from a number of places, as you were saying, because neighboring Persia was crumbling at this time. You have a lot of Persian immigrants coming to look for employment at the Mughal court and then at other courts, whoever had the resources to patronize them. You have the remainders of the Turkey influence that was there from the time of Akbar. They all came as well at that time. You have the Armenians here, you have Sunnis, you have Shia Muslims, you have, of course, the Hindus, you have local Sheikhzadas, Muslims who are born here, and you have Europeans of different hues and colors. You have the French, you have the English. And one such immigrant family, therefore, as Manu was saying, was a Persian immigrant family. And this was Sadat Khan, who became one of the chief commanders of the Mughal emperor, Muhammad Shah Rangile. And from his time onwards, he started and he was able to found a hereditary dynasty. And one of the most interesting characters in the story, I think, is Shuja-ud-Dawla. He's the third Nawab. And he is somebody who is born to the manor born, if you like, because his family were Nawabs from the time he was born. He is known nothing but luxury and excess. He is something of a spoilt firstborn son, and he is very much indulged. And as a young man, he is mostly known for flying kites, keeping pigeons, and climbing the walls of young ladies' houses trying to get into their homes. But he becomes embroiled in the Battle of Buxar. He leads the Mughal armies, and he has never faced defeat in battle. So this is a very key moment for him. And when he is defeated finally by the British at the Battle of Buxar, this is a moment of reckoning for him. He comes back to Awadh, and from this time onwards, he will no longer offer assistance to the Mughal emperor. So he will receive him in his own home when he comes, looking for help, and he will show him largesse and give him gifts. But he will no longer ever be militarily involved because he has seen the price he has paid. Instead, he starts hiring Frenchmen, French soldiers, French, all sorts of French help comes to him at this time because he is famous now as one of the last remaining powerful Indian rulers, and he invests all his enormous treasure and resources into building architecture, into making his country very stable, and just increasing the prosperity of his area. And after him comes Asaf-ud-Daula, who is really the founder of Lucknowi culture as we know it today.
Wasn't Awadh a kind of punishment posting for the founder of the dynasty to start with before they turned it into this great center? These Nawabs also have these strange personal quirks, right? You briefly alluded to they're spoiled, they're chasing women, all of that. And in this guy's case, Shuja's case, defeat essentially leads to character building, and he becomes a Nawab to look up to. But some of the influences that are also involved in character building are the Begums. So we come back to the women now in the court, because clearly, as you mentioned earlier, they're not passive entities. They're not just sitting around in the harem waiting for their beloveds to come. These are women with ideas. These are women with monetary resources. These are women with influence. Of course, they also clash with each other, but at the same time, sometimes they can work cooperatively to rein in the Nawab, to sort of push the Nawab in the right direction, and generally be a force of, or a great influence in the Awadh Darbar. So tell us a little bit about those two remarkable Begums in the Awadh court and also their wealth.
That's right. So the first Begum is Nawab Begum. So she is the mother of Shujauddaulah, and she is already very important in Delhi alongside her husband Safdarjung. And this is where they really generate, a lot of their power and their prestige and their wealth is in Delhi. But of course, then they are posted to Awadh, and then they remain in Awadh after that. And she is pretty instrumental, I think, from the beginning in shaping the character of Shujauddaulah, because he is caught once, he's caught several times climbing the walls of a beautiful young woman's house. So the Kotwal catches him, and he brings him to the Nawab and the Begum, and he's a bit scared, I've caught the Nawab's son in flagrante, what do I do with him? So he presents the very young adolescent Shuja to his parents, and Nawab Begum says, "How dare you disturb us in the middle of the night? Don't you know your duty? Don't you know what you must do with miscreants like this?" And in fact, Shujauddaulah is then thrown into jail, and every week he is brought in front of his parents to see if they have forgiven him, and they keep sending him back. And he has to spend a lot of time in jail because they are so horrified that their own son has transgressed, the rules of how the nobility and the elite must conduct themselves. So this shows, the strength of character of Nawab Begum. But Begum is the one we know.
Before Bahu Begum, a quick curious question. When you say Nawab Begum and Bahu Begum, these are not their personal names.
No,
These
so
are like
that's
titles.
no. So Nawab Begum is Sadr-un-Nisa Begum, known as Nawab Begum. And Bahu Begum is Zinat-un-Nisa Begum. It becomes quite a mouthful, so even I've started using their titles instead. And then we come across, of course, Bahu Begum. And what's extraordinary about Bahu Begum, she has this huge trousseau. She grows up in the court of Delhi. She is the daughter of a famous Delhi nobleman. So she has a lot of personal wealth. When she gets married, the Mughal emperor himself sends part of the dowry for her. At that time, there was still a little bit of wealth remaining. So she has an enormous trousseau, enormous personal wealth. And as we know in India, Muslim women are allowed to keep their personal wealth, unlike what was happening in Britain, where they have to hand over their money, their dowry to the husband. So these women are enormously wealthy. When Shujauddaulah is defeated at the Battle of Buxar, the terms that are drawn up for him in return for getting back his land, otherwise he's an exile, he has no place to go. He has to pay an enormous war subsidy of 50 lakhs of rupees of those time right away. And he starts asking around, asking his allies, asking his noblemen. Everybody turns their backs on him. Only Bahu Begum, when she hears this, she collects everything that is lying around her in her home. She takes all the jewelry, the clothes, whatever money, gold coins, and she hands them over to Shujauddaulah. And Shujauddaulah pays off his debt to the British East India Company. Now, Bahu Begum never forgets this, nor does Shujauddaulah. And from this time onwards, he and Bahu Begum come back to Faizabad, and he gives all his surplus revenue money, he gives to Bahu Begum. And later on, when Bahu Begum will argue with the British for her own right to keep this treasure, she writes, and it is written in the records, "This is my personal property. I gave it to you to write off this debt. So I own it. You have no rights to it." Because the British argument was that as a widow, she has no rights to her own property. She must hand it over to us, the British East India Company. But she holds her own against the British, and all the local writers, the biographers, are in agreement with her. And they say, yes, of course, we know this. Shujauddaulah recognized her as the one who saved him. And so she is able to use this argument. Later on, when both the Begums are under threat, at the time of insurrection, which is quite a complicated story, but the Raja of Benares has been arrested, and there's wholesale insurrection in Awadh, in the countryside, in the cities. Nawab Begum suggests to her daughter-in-law, with whom she has clashed on matters of fashion and other matters previously. But at this time, when their territory and their independence is being questioned, she tells Bahu Begum, "Let us ride out, you and I together, and let us see who of the old guard will follow us into battle." So this old lady, long-time widow of Safdarjung, is willing to go into battle, a parda-bound woman. So I found these words so moving and so inspiring. I put this in a little incident, again, what you were saying. I have not really come across this when men historians have written about this period. But to me, it was very striking to think of a parda-bound woman who has lived her life in luxury within palace walls, is proposing to her daughter-in-law that they go out and fight both the British and Nawab Asafuddaulah, because at that time he is very embarrassed about it, but he needs the money. So he has been trying to get this money. Nawab Begum says, "We will fight your son, we will fight the British." So, these little stories, I think, bring to life the women.
Asaf is the grandson.
So Asaf is Nawab Begum's grandson, Bahu Begum's only
And he
son.
basically wants Granny and Mummy's treasure.
He wants
it.
Granny and Mummy's treasure desperately because, then he can keep up the pomp and circumstance that he would like to have. But what is interesting is also, again, reading this, from an Indian point of view, the British always tell us, and even recordings tell us, that Asaf behaved like this with his mother. His mother had no right to keep her treasure. Asaf had to attack her and get. This is entirely untrue. Asaf, they almost made him ill, with the British, with their pressure on Asaf, relentless pressure for him to demand money of his mother. He said, "I can't do this. She will give me whatever she thinks right." He had other means of getting money. He said, "I cannot demand anything of my mother and my mother-in-law." He was, you can read when they describe how he was, you can see his reluctance, you can see his despair at being basically dragged by the British to sort of force his mother and grandmother to hand over their treasure. He never wanted to do this. This is yet one more story that the British have interpreted through their lens.
It's interesting because the British must have seen it purely as a financial transaction, but for the Indians involved in the Awadh court, there's elements of honor and izzat left. Even when you said that the two Begums said, "Let's go to war and see who follows us," you can almost see that a lot of noblemen who are otherwise wishy-washy would be shamed into standing up and doing their duty.
Yeah,
and
they would
similarly here, the grandson would have felt that his honor would be besmirched if he went and seized his mother and grandmother's gold. What ultimately happens to the treasure? Because it leads to all kinds of...
So it leads to all, it's a pretty large part of the book because it's such an interesting story. So she pays a small amount. What they do, what Governor General Hastings does finally, since he cannot actually access the women. The women are supposed to be in Parda. These are elite Indian women. At this time, Awadh is amongst the most powerful, respected areas of India. So to physically attack these women is out of the question, even for Hastings. So he finds an indirect way. He captures their eunuchs, the noble, the elite eunuchs of the court called the Khwaja Saras. All these ladies interacted with the outside world through eunuchs, who were very politically important parts of the Awadh court and of many other courts in India. So he imprisons them and keeps them in chains. And we hear that, so the physical hardship isn't that great, except that they're not allowed pan, and God knows that must have been a huge torture for them. Pan and I think tobacco even was denied to them. Apart from that, they are not very physically harmed, but they are made to ride in a bullock cart. And the shame and dishonor of riding in a bullock cart when, as an elite eunuch, elite member of the court, you are riding on elephants, riding on horses, riding in palanquins. This was the ultimate dishonor for them, and they are brought down almost to tears. They are imprisoned for 2 years, at the end of which some treasure is taken out. It is literally dug out of the ground from various hiding places. There's a list of the hiding places. I've added it in a footnote. So they give some of the money, but her enormous treasure, the surplus of it, remains with Bahu Begum throughout her long life. She outlives everyone. She outlives Asaf Uddola. She outlives the next Nawab, Saadat Ali Khan. She outlives Hastings. And she dies still a very wealthy woman in control of her money. But at the end, because the new Nawab is clearly a tool, a puppet of the British, she actually leaves the money to the East India Company herself.
On the note of these Khwaja Saras, these royal eunuchs, it's interesting that the Western cliche was that oh, the harem, the women are just lounging around. There are these eunuchs guarding it, plotting with the begums to destabilize power, etc. But the way you've presented them, they're eunuchs with great power, they're eunuchs with great personality, great resources, and they have a mind. They are also advisors, and you make this interesting point that they are those rare figures who have access to the outside world of the darbar, but also the inside world of the harem, and become the bridge between the court, as it were, and where the ladies are, and they therefore play a very important connecting role.
They do, they do. And the British were very confused about their role. And in today's world, I blame Game of Thrones for giving us that figure of the spider, the eunuch. Because the ones, strangely enough, as you were saying, the British portray the eunuchs in very effete tones, in androgynous tones, talk about them as having a mincing way about them, something that was, not quite healthy, something that was, very feminine, but in an unhealthy way. Whereas when the male writers write about the Khwaja Saras, they talk about them in virile terms. They talk about them as being strong men, as being very upright, being involved in very physically demanding sports, in very manly pursuits like horse riding, like archery. So already there, right there, we see how different the portrayal is of this category. And of course, as Manu was saying, these were uniquely important men because they were at that liminal space, at the threshold of the Begum's Darwaza. In fact, they used to have a guard of eunuchs at her Darwaza, allowing people in or not allowing them in. So these eunuchs had multiple roles. They were politically very important. They could have roles like military commanders. They could be head of the household. They could be head of the intelligence. So, spying was a very, very important activity at this time. And it was often the Khwaja Saras, the eunuchs, who were the best informed men. They would have their own men in all the major darbars of India and get the information through runners coming to them with rolled up pieces of paper tucked behind the ear. And they had information about the inside of the Zanana. So, for example, an interesting, little aside is that when Asaf Uddola got married, there had always been rumors about Asaf Uddola's sexuality. So they sent a eunuch into the bedchamber at the time of Asaf's marriage, and they said, "You will tell us." The Nawab and the Begum, Shujauddaulah and Nawab Begum said, "You must tell us what happens. Is the marriage consummated?" And it is never said what was relayed to them, but clearly it wasn't, because this lady eventually lived a separate life, and we know that Asaf Uddola was homosexual. But these men, therefore, the eunuchs, had incredibly powerful roles, and the British really struggled to figure out how to handle them. And the eunuchs, in a way, show us this transitory period in India between the old ways of the Mughal court, what we could still call the medieval world, and the early modern world, because the eunuchs were slowly written out of history. Their usefulness was no longer desired, and the British started treating them with a great deal of scorn and disrespect.
It's very rare to come across homosexual figures with this degree of depth and interesting information in Indian history books. So that's another thing. We don't have too much time to go into that. So I'll ask you the other important piece of the puzzle, which is the presence of the French. Often when we think of colonialism in India, the white man's presence in India in the 18th century, it's very English focused. East India Company, Bengal, all of that. But we forget that till the mid 18th century, firstly, the French were in a very important position. They could have been the next important power in India. But even so, almost for the next 60, 70 years, French influence does continue through mercenaries, through these sporadic presences here and there in different parts of India. So tell us a little bit about the French. And I'm also curious because most scholars studying colonialism focus again on British records, whereas you read French, therefore you've also been able to access French records. And is there anything surprising or what are the interesting elements there?
Yes, I think this is one area that we have forgotten both in France and in India, is the French presence throughout the 18th century and how close we came to having this conversation in French, you and I, Manu, because by the early 18th century, France was by far the more powerful nation. That changed by the mid 18th century, and after that, France's role becomes far less, their ambitions are far less territorial. They are no longer interested in conquest, but they have a clearly defined role, a role that comes from the King Louis XV in France and his minister Choiseul, who says that you must block British ambitions because France and England at this time are the enormous sworn enemies who are fighting global battles all around the world. So in India, they have a role to block British ambitions wherever they can by bolstering whichever Indian ruler is willing to listen to them, whichever Indian ruler is aware of the British menace and is willing to take on their help. So that is something that was quite interesting. But as you say, because their ambitions change in the latter half, we don't see them militarily very active. Instead, we see their influence in the arts, in culture. They are the patrons of some amazing works of art, especially, even a few decades before the British. So this yet one more place where the victors have written, their stories. We think of company art as really patronized and begun by the British. Actually, scholars have shown it was the French in Faizabad patronizing works of art that came out of there, which were unique for their time and really founded the so-called later Company School of Art. And what was also interesting was the points of view that some of these French men mostly write down in their records, in the way in which they view India. Now, of course, they were in a very different position, but they seem to view India as at the same time as a land of eternal. A land which has not changed for a long time. Like, eternal India is a phrase that is found again and again, as if India was fixed in time and nobody was changing, nobody was adapting. That was something that was interesting. But at the same time, they are quite aware and respectful of Indian teachings, Indian culture. They are one of the first to start reading in Persian and then later reading in Sanskrit and translating some of those works. So I'm able to, I hope, bring out some of these stories, which, as you say, were not translated, some of them. They were not available to Indian scholars. So some of these points of view are interwoven in the main thread of the narrative.
I forget the exact name of the man, but there was one figure in your book after whom universities and institutions have been named, but he was also a bit of a pedophile and
Yes,
all of that.
I try not to say that too much in my talks. You never know
You'll get cancelled.
who is from La Martinière school, but that's Claude Martin. He is one of the figures I talk about. He became the most powerful and the richest one, the one we seem to remember today, even though there are some very problematic things about his character, which also betray the times, the 18th century, the way in which European men were able to act out, their lives in India with no consequences, really. So yes, he was quite a problematic figure. But apart from all of that, he did also patronize what is only now being recognized as one of the first and most consequential botanical paintings in the world, which lie today in the Kew Gardens. So maybe a little bit of a redeeming factor there.
All right, Ira has to catch a flight, so we'll start. We've got some more time, but we'll just take questions now for 5 minutes, and then she can safely leave for the airport. Questions? Raise your hand, and the mic will come to you. Where?
There's a lady there next to the camera.
Mic ille. അവിടെ നിൽക്കുന്നു.
So happy to meet you both who wrote history from women's perspective. My question is that can you see any difference from the way women in the South dealt with power and whereas women in the north dealt with power. For example, like one I can think is like Sethu Lakshmi Bai is someone who dealt with the British face to face, whereas women in Zenana were the ones who had mediators between them. So, any other differences or even similarities?
I don't think. I mean, Irash can answer this part, which is that the presence of mediators in the between the Begums and the British, as opposed to face-to-face interaction in later periods. I don't think that would have been a weakness. In some ways, it could also be a strength, right?
No, absolutely. I think the presence of the mediators, they were able to use it as a strength. They used some very talented, educated men. These Khwaja Saras had the best education. They used them to send them out to do their trade for them. For example, the Mughal women, they used, traders and agents to interact with them. They used them to interact with the Europeans. So it enabled them to keep this idea of an allure about them that was, almost unbroachable. Like you could not approach them. The European men were kept at a distance. So were all the other men as well. But it really, I think, it really troubled the European men to not have access to the women. So in a certain sense, at least for the elite women, keeping this distance through the parda and using in between go-betweens who were very talented and very able people to do their jobs for them, it was actually something of I think something that was very useful for them in maintaining that allure.
But yes, in South India, there was a difference in the sense that here, when the first Dutch and the Portuguese came, they were astonished to find these topless, bare-breasted queens receiving them openly, and they never could get their head around that. So yeah, which is very different from the Parda Begum, right?
I can't match anything as exciting as topless women meeting the Europeans, Manu.
Any more questions?
Hi, good evening. So, both of you have been writing history with a lot of conviction and detail. So, I would like to know about the journey while wanting to pen these down, especially when the resources are very limited, and especially when it comes to women in history, it's either destroyed or not documented. So, how was your journey while wanting to pen these with a lot of detail and narration? I was listening to you, and you have been giving a lot of details while you talk. So I would love to know how your journey has been through. The question goes both ways. Like,
Thank you so much. I'll just start with that, then Manu can take over. We had a nice discussion this morning, in fact, with Manu and Pierre and Jerry about this very issue. Is that, at least in my experience, the resources are there, they exist. It's just that they are very scattered, and it takes a certain point of view, it takes a certain determination to find them out. So, for example, one of my very first encounters with this discrepancy about how powerful women had been, and yet the complete obliteration of knowledge around them, was in India when I took part in a heritage walk around Delhi, just out of curiosity. And the first structure we saw was a mosque and madrasa complex next to the Humayun's tomb. You will be familiar with the huge mausoleum of Humayun in Delhi. So next to this very important center, there's actually the first Mughal mosque and madrasa was built by a woman, Mahamanga. She was a milk mother of Akbar's. And I was absolutely astonished. I said, women, we are told that they didn't patronize anything. I didn't know there was something at my doorstep. I was living in Delhi. Then I came across the story of Jahanara Begum. Because I visited her burial site, which is in the Dargah of Nizamuddin Aulia. Now, it looks like a very small, uninspiring sort of structure, but that is how Sufi saints are buried. And she is buried in close proximity of the holy presence of Nizamuddin Aulia. So that means she was actually a very powerful woman to be able to have herself buried, her tomb right there. And putting these separate pieces of information, I realized that really the information is there. You just need to have the will and the point of view and the sort of pro-woman bias, I suppose you can call it that, to sort of pick out these little nuggets from the vast sea of male-dominated material that is lying there. But in my experience, the material is there. It is just far more delicate and fragile.
Same. The women are there. It's just that most people are not trained or inclined to look for them. If you look for them, you will find the evidence. Do we have more questions? It's 5:50.
I think I might have to wrap up. I'm so sorry to do a very Delhi thing of, just do this and run off. But my flight, and I'm told there's a lot of traffic at this time. Thank you very much for all being here this evening. Thank you to
Thank
Manu
you.
for taking this
Thank
time.
you, Ira, for being a wonderful
Thank you.
speaker. Thank you for being here. Ira is off. I'm off for my signing in case anyone wants to come. Thank you.